Hello and welcome to today's Right Hive 2021 panel on the topic Decolonize Your Craft, Rethinking Fantasy Races. My name is Stephanie Contreras and I will be the panel moderator. I have three amazing panelists with me, so if you have any questions on this topic, please drop them in the chat for us. Now I'd like to introduce our panel. First, we have Anya Leigh Josephs. Anya holds a BA from Columbia University and an MA from UCLA, both in English. They live in New York City with their cat, Sycorax, where they are pursuing a career in social work. Their writing has been published in Fantasy Magazine, Mythaxis, and Andromeda Spaceways Magazine, among others, and they are a member of SFWA. Their queer YA epic fantasy trilogy, beginning with Queen of All, is forthcoming from Zenith Press on June 8th. Anya, please share with us your pronouns and a little bit more about you.
Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to be here for this panel. I think this is a super important and interesting topic. And I'll also say as an epic fantasy writer, I'm especially excited about it because I think that epic fantasy doesn't always get treated with the care and attention that it deserves. And we don't always have a lot of like fantasy specific craft discussions. So I'm really excited to chat with my fellow panelists about this today. I use they, them, theirs pronouns. What else about me? I write all kinds of things. I write for theater, I write nonfiction, I write essays, I write poetry. But my heart is really with speculative fiction, and particularly with the young adult high fantasy trilogy that I've been working on since I was 12 years old. So 15 years later, it is, as of the time of this recording, author copies are on their way to me. And so that's pretty exciting. That's kind of been the biggest part of my writing career to date, is getting this book cleaned up and ready to share with the world. So I'm really excited to be here today.
Thank you, Anya, and congratulations. So our next panelist is C.H. Hung. C.H. Hung grew up among the musty book stacks of public libraries where she found a lifelong love for good stories and lost 20/20 vision for good. She possesses a stubbornly rational soul intersecting with an irrational belief in magic, which means her stories are often as mixed up as she is, melding the plausible with myth and folklore. Read more at www.chhung.com. CH, please share with us your pronouns and a little bit more about you.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. So in everyday usage, I go by Cindy, so you can call me Cindy if you'd like. I write under C.H. Hung, so that's where you'll find my stories. And primarily, I write science fiction, fantasy, short fiction. You'll find my stories coming up in Analog Magazine, Dreamforge Magazine, Choreo Magazine, and also several anthologies, including a few edited by Kevin J. Anderson and Christine Catherine Rush, among others. And my pronouns are she and her. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much and welcome. Now, last but not least, we have Whitney Hill. Whitney Hill writes award-winning adult fantasy with sizzle and soul from Durham, North Carolina. Her worlds feature the diversity she has lived as a biracial woman of color and former migrant to Europe. She draws on these life experiences to write characters, drawing on inner strength to carve out a place for themselves. Elemental, her award-winning urban fantasy debut and book one in the Shadows of Other Side series, is on sale wherever books are sold. Whitney also enjoys hiking in North Carolina's beautiful state parks and learning about world mythology. Learn more or get in touch at www.whitneyhillwrites.com. Whitney, please share with us your pronouns and a little bit more about you.
Hey everybody, it's so great to be here. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am a sci-fi fantasy writer, mostly for fantasy right now, contemporary fantasy, a little bit of historical fantasy in the works, and I've got the Shadows of Other Side series, starting with Elemental. Book 3 has just come out, let's see, 3 weeks ago, almost a month ago. Wow, time flies. And I'm just so excited to be here and, talk about this really important topic and kind of bring my experiences with being, a marginalized person and a fantasy fan, to the perspective of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Whitney. Okay, so we've come together to discuss decolonizing your craft. Why don't we go ahead and get to some of our questions and answers, starting with our first question. What does decolonizing your craft mean, and what does it have to do with fantasy races? Can I stick with you, Whitney, to start?
Yeah, sure. So for me, decolonizing your craft is taking a step back to look at the different values that inform power, not just who has it, but the structures that support it. Aesthetics, anything, what is beautiful to who is beautiful. Relationships between people and what's appropriate and expected for people to do with each other or to each other as it may happen. And other aspects that affect the story, like organization, like the setting, like the resource use. And fantasy races are very often written using language which, whether intentionally or not, codes in a lot of ways and very frequently to real human races or ethnicities. And very frequently that can be harmful. And it's especially because of, historically who has been writing fantasy, what their objections have been, or what their objectives have been, in the writing, their influences, their thoughts, the thoughts of the times, in terms of who was quote unquote superior, and what the roles of people in society were, at various levels, at various, locations. And it's frankly, to me, impossible to separate the writer from their writing. And when you don't take time to evaluate, yourself, your times, what's going on in the world, that does make itself, its way into the writing. And we're at a point, I think, especially now, where people are really starting to look at and challenge, what has come before. So I'd say, they're definitely colonization and fantasy are intimately entwined.
Thank you for that. Anya, what would you add to that?
Well, I think in a lot of ways Whitney said it all, but I'll still talk. I see decolonizing one's craft as sort of an ongoing obligation that we have, because creating art, like everything else, is political in nature. And if you're not working towards decolonizing your craft, then your craft risks becoming a tool for further colonization. And so I think that's why it's so important. And when I think of decolonizing my craft, I think of it as step one sort of being recognizing the colonial structures that are at play in writing fantasy at a really deep level, right? Really deep kind of assumptions that a certain way that people relate to each other in forms of privilege and power is necessary or essential for a story world to work, for example. Another big one, and I'm excited to dive into this topic deeper today, is the way that fantasy races are used both to reiterate, but then also to erase like real world racism. And there's so many ways that if you're not being thoughtful about decolonizing your craft sort of automatically becomes this colonial tool. And a lot of the examples I can think of fantasy races being done poorly is not necessarily out of malice, and not necessarily an outright attempt to portray certain races or ethnicities as lesser. It's just not being a sort of blindedness coming from privilege of not seeing that a fantasy race is analogous to a real world race. And so I think it's really important for writers to decolonize their craft in that sense. And then when it comes to fantasy races. Like I said, I'm really excited to dive into this topic because I think that in schools of writing and MFA programs and even in writing groups, we tend to see literary fiction being really held up as the ideal of what craft looks like, and this unique skills that it takes to write fantasy, especially sort of like epic second world fantasy, effectively aren't always valued as much. And so I'm really excited to dive into the specific topic and the specific skills that it takes to do that in a decolonial way. I think one thing that I'll bring up right here at the beginning is the history of how different like races, different mythological races made their way into fantasy, because it's been this strange kind of iterative process where like it all started with Lord of the Rings. And then authors imitating that and the way that Tolkien broke down fantasy races, and then other authors imitating those other authors. And that kind of created this weird sort of like standard array of races that you find in high fantasy novels, in a way that is very peculiar and has its own inbuilt set of stereotypes. And I think that if you want to be a decolonial author, it's important to start breaking those down. It's also important if you just want to be original. So I'm excited to, dive more into ways to do that and authors that I think are doing excellent work doing this today, because there are many.
Thank you so much. Cindy, final thoughts on that?
Well, Anya and Whitney pretty much covered it all. But I would add, I think a lot of us get into writing fantasy because we start out as fans of fantasy. And yes, it starts with Tolkien. It starts with the creators who came before us building upon the tropes that they fell in love with in the first place. So to me, decolonizing your craft means taking that step back and recognizing that what you fell in love with may not be a good thing the way it's currently portrayed. Like, it does need updating now that we're 30, 40, 50 years past that creation date. And we need to make sure that our craft is evolving just as our cultures are evolving. And they're more reflective of who we are now as people, and are more inclusive of the entire fandom and not just a small subset.
I think that's a good point. And essentially, the people that we're having this panel with are fellow writers of ours. So if we can dig a little bit deeper, like as writers, why is it so important for us to have this discussion? Why don't I stay with you, Cindy? I know that we've, brushed on this a little bit in some of our answers already, but Cindy, what do you think? Like, why as authors should we be talking about this maybe more, especially in this day and age?
Because I think too many of us who are from marginalized populations often feel that we don't have a seat at the table, or we don't have an opportunity to voice our opinions or to put our spin on things, because we're just not there. We're not represented in this fiction. Tolkien's brought up as a perennial example because of the way orcs and orcs are depicted in that world, where it's just they're just straight up villains, and he's using very specific words like slanted eyes and swarthy and sallow skinned, and it's just like, you can't use those words today. Like, that's not something that's good and reflective on who we want to be as people. And so when we talk about these things, it sort of opens up the door for other people who felt uncomfortable and didn't know how to talk about these things, and didn't know that there's a safe place to say, hey, I don't think this is right. I think there's a better way to come up with fantasy races and to describe people and characters that aren't so derogatory, and don't have that burden of historical slurs behind them. And it just gives us opportunity to hear from more voices and to sort of create more room at the table for more creators, because there's a lot of us out there. I know I'm not the only one who grew up loving D&D and realizing I was the only Asian girl at the table. So yeah.
Very fair point. Anya, how would you add to that?
I think that the Tolkien example is really eye-opening because I think that really answers the question of why this matters so much. When Tolkien was writing his dwarves as a metaphor for the Jewish people's exile from their home, he did not necessarily anticipate that that was going to get turned into a bajillion weirdly anti-Semitic depictions of fantasy races that were short and obsessed with gold and had hooked noses and run banks in wizarding worlds. But it did, right? And his decision to do that, the way that he chose to, you know, depict a as far as the way that he tried to depict the dwarves as a metaphor for Jews, he actually had extremely noble intentions in doing that. If you read what he wrote about it, I don't think he probably anticipated the way that the kind of cultural effect that that would still be having, you know, half a century later. And I think that really shows the importance of doing this in a thoughtful way, because you have to ask yourself these questions. And for all the other writers out there, I think it's kind of helpful to frame it in a positive way. What if you're the next huge influence? What if what you write remakes the world of fantasy literature for the next 50 years? You want to do a good, responsible job with everything you're doing, right? Like what kind of world do you want to help shape? Imagine that you have the amount of cultural power that something like Lord of the Rings or D&D has. What kind of influence do you want to be having on the world? And so that's the question that I try to ask myself. And that's a big burden to put on your own shoulders, especially if you yourself are a marginalized writer. And I don't think it's completely fair to say that, you know, one person should have to reshape culture in that way, but I think it gives us a sense of the scope of these kind of decisions. And that's really why it matters. And Cindy, you mentioned D&D, and as someone who's in Mumble 4 Dungeons and Dragons campaigns right now, 2 of which I run, it's a really good pandemic activity because it's like you don't have to like talk to everybody about their lives, but you still get to spend time with people, right? Also, you get to pretend to be a dragon, and that's awesome. The tables that I play at are all really diverse in lots of different ways, but the material itself is so not welcoming to the existence of diversity. And there are so many ways that like racism and sexism and classism are baked into the fundamental mechanics of the thing that like, as I'm trying to, I don't know, I have a player who wants to walk in and start a bar fight. And the first thing that he would think to do would be to see an elf and be like, hey, pointy ears, what's up? And just like invent slurs and introduce them into my previously racism-free fantasy world. And like that, but that's baked into the way the game is written. And so I think, you know, there's this huge amount of influence that specific cultural properties can have that last a really long time and become really big. So I think this is important because it's important to say, if I'm going to have this huge influence, what kind of influence do I want to have? And especially because there are more own voices fantasy stories. There are more and more fantasy stories where there are actually, you know, characters of marginalized identities that get to explicitly be on the page and that are written by people from that background and that can share real experience. But when I was growing up, for example, there were not any gay characters in the fantasy YA novels I was reading. But there were some characters who were sort of queer coded in certain ways, right? Like there were the witches who lived alone in the woods and had a lot of cats and never married. And that was as close as I got to getting representation. So what kind of representation are you giving through that metaphor? And I think that has a really big impact on readers.
Great points, thank you. Whitney, any final thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be the theme. Anya and Cindy both, really did a great job covering it. But I think just generally, again, colonialism determines not only whose lives are valued, but also whose stories are told. And it's just kind of like, it perpetuates itself because nobody wants to lose power. Nobody wants to really share power because in the way that at least, I'm speaking from a United States, background, losing power can feel like oppression if you're not, used to being in that position. And I think that's where a lot of people are just kind of struggling with it, from their own backgrounds. They're struggling with it in their writing. And we do have to acknowledge at this point in time, especially that for a long time, the voices that have mattered most and the voices that have been the loudest have been those of the descendants of the colonized. Those who were colonized, those who were enslaved to support colonization have not been heard from. And it might seem like they are because all of a sudden, it feels like diversity is a buzzword, and it feels like there are a lot of really successful books by marginalized people coming out. But that's almost a symptom of the problem of ongoing colonialization, because the fact that we're now noticing and it looks like it, but it's not really true. If we look at the Leigh and Low diversity baseline study that came out last year, they noted there had been no significant change in the racial demographics of the publishing industry in the last 4 years. And prior to that, there had been no change in the 4 years, preceding the other study. So it's like, this is why we need to have the discussion around whose stories are being told, why, who's being represented, who's being left out, and what does that mean for all of us? And, Anya and Cindy, I think, both touched on propaganda and how that, for, however it's intended to support a group or to denigrate a group, how that all becomes self-perpetuating. And if nothing's changing in publishing and nobody's establishing, a critical evaluation of their work, frankly, it won't change. It has to be an active thing. And that's why we have to have this discussion. That's why it's important.
Thank you. Good points all around. So our next question is, if you started a list that said, here are some clear signs that a story has colonization themes, like what would be on your list? And I think one of the reasons why we wanted to ask this is because, perhaps there's a writer that says, I understand what you're saying to this point, but maybe I don't recognize what those themes are in my own stories. So if we were to maybe give some ideas, what are some things that we could look for? Why don't we start with you, Anya?
So I would actually differentiate between stories that have themes of colonization and stories that have colonized themes, because I think that writing about the concept of colonization can actually be like a super incredible and powerful thing to do, especially in fantasy worlds. So I don't want to discourage writers from exploring themes having to do with colonization. I think there are ways you can look at your writing and say, some of these tropes suggest that my writing might need to be decolonized. So a couple things that I would look at. A good rule of thumb for me is if there are different races in this world, what does it mean to be a member of a race? And what does that tell you about the character? For example, if you're writing a race of orcs and they are all bad and unswervingly violent, that to me would be a red flag that is a colonized theme. If you are writing, I have two sort of near human magical races in my own novel series. And if I were to construct either of them as all being only one way, all good or all bad or all smart or all sneaky or like any kind of generalization, first of all, you'd have to be really, really careful about doing that in a way that doesn't map onto any real world stereotypes. But even if you don't, even if you manage to, invent something that isn't a nice metaphor for real world racism, I think that's still a red flag because that is just not how race works in reality. It doesn't determine everything about who you are or what you look like or really anything. So that would be one big red flag. I would also look at what are, what are relationships and histories like between different races, because you get a lot in fantasy novels like race A hates race B and they have always been at war for many, many millennia. And if you look at the real world, in the real world, there are ethnic groups that have historically been in conflict. But if you look at the actual history of the conflict, it's much more complicated than they've always unswervingly hated each other for millennia. So I think that's important to look at. And I would also be really, really careful about using magical powers as a metaphor for racism. This isn't something that it is impossible to do well. Lots of writers do it very skillfully, but it's done a lot in a lot of different media where some people are hated or ostracized or feared, or alternatively are in charge in the society because they were born with certain magical abilities or traits. And that's a really imperfect metaphor for real world racism, because in the real world, people of color don't have magic powers, and that's not why we have this history of colonization in the real world. It's not because of a true innate difference, like the ability to blow things up with your mind. And I worry that becomes, it's almost easier to excuse the fantasy racism when it exists because of something as, let's say tangibly dangerous as uncontrollable magic powers. So those are some of the things that I would look at. I would also say, look at the different cultures that exist in your world, because race doesn't and shouldn't map perfectly onto culture. And if, let's say in your world, all of the humans live in one area and speak one language, and all of the orcs live in another area and speak another language, is there no trade between them? Do they never intermarry? Is there never any kind of like group society? What about the people that live on the border? So I think those kinds of questions, those would be things that those would be themes that I would look into, or that would kind of be anything that's kind of absolutist and determinative when it comes to do with race. Those would be kind of the red flags I would look out for.
Thank you for starting our list and for that important clarification. Cindy, what would you add to our list?
So I think Whitney touched upon this earlier when she talked about superiority. And one of the biggest red flags that I see is when you have a story arc that includes what's essentially a white savior, but I would also argue it's any outsider to that culture who comes in and saves that culture from itself. And that to me just smacks so much of colonialism, and it just, it inherently puts one culture above another, it's saying one culture is more superior or better in some way. And that's just not the best place to start with when you're trying to diversify your fantasy races. And then one point about magic being an analogy for racism, I would say the one person who has done this extremely well is N.K. Jemisin in her Broken Earth trilogy. The way she described orogeny, which is the magic system there, and the erogenes, which is the magic users. I read it and I couldn't believe she pulled it off, because I was like, this is amazing. This is basically subtext of racism, and I was like, oh, I bow down to you, lady, because I cannot believe you pulled that off. It was really well done.
That was exactly the example I was thinking of when I said it can be done well. I guess the rest of that sentence was if you're N.K. Jemisin.
Yes.
Perfect. Whitney, what would you say for our list?
Yeah, I mean, obviously homogenous societies, anything that's overly simplified like that. I mean, I think Anya really touched on that really well. I'd add not only physical traits, but also how people are described. So that's not just evil or primitive. That's also, do you use words like exotic, or who is fetishized as having a particularly desirable trait? I think we see that a lot with people who are colonized, as they're kind of seen as these exotic and maybe sexy or something, and it's really kind of gross how I think especially women are treated, and we see that being an increasing problem, particularly lately with some events that have happened in the United States and worldwide. I think also not just to do with the characters themselves, but also the themes in the story. So if you're Western and you are never questioning themes like individualism or pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, those are very, very, Western, maybe particularly capitalistic, maybe especially United States focused ideas that do need to be questioned because they're not universal, they're not global, they're not necessarily good for everyone. And not only not good, but they're actively harmful for a lot of people. I think maybe also with fantasy, we've got a lot of explorers and settlers and people, there is actually a subgenre of sci-fi, colonization. Why are those people colonizing somewhere? Why did they leave? Are we really digging into the backgrounds, the backstories of our worlds, our histories, our characters, and asking, okay, like even if they had to flee their world because it was broken somehow, what does that mean for the people who live where they are going already? Because, unless they're going and terraforming some completely blank slate rock with no bacteria even, you're moving in on somebody's home, and that will have consequences for both sides. I don't think it necessarily has to be by default a conflicting situation. I think that's something else to unpack and to, look at very carefully. But I do think anytime we're just seeing the glorification of explorers and settlers, that's a big red flag for me. And just, again, as we've touched on also, the inherent superiority or inferiority of certain groups. And it has been mentioned, by both Anya and Cindy, that you can write about these things. It's nobody's saying you can't write colonial, sci-fi. You can't write magic, chosen ones. But the trick is to do it with nuance, and the trick is also to question or show your characters questioning, somebody questioning, why is it like this? What is the reason for it? And what is the impact on the world, on the characters, on the setting? So I'd say yes, I think we've all given a pretty thorough list. But for anybody worried, I think the solution is to do it consciously and to question what's on that list.
Thank you. Very, very good points. Okay, so our next question, and I think we have talked about this a little bit, is why are we so entrenched in these older fantasy archetypes? Why don't we start with Cindy?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, I think it starts with the fact that we all started as fans, but also there is definitely a aspect of gatekeeping that's firmly entrenched. Back 30, 40, 50 years ago, when these stories were coming out, traditional publishing was the route to publishing. We didn't have the self-publishing resources that we have today, or the small presses and the indie presses that are revolutionizing publishing as well. And so you had a very select few people, basically saying, well, this is okay to publish because you're going to find a wide audience and we're going to make money off this. And then, of course, you gather this fandom and you have this tide of people who love, the elves and the dwarves and the orcs and whatever and all of that stuff. Today, yes, of course, you still have people who love that stuff, the gatekeepers have moved to a different platform. We've now moved online. We've moved to social media. We've moved to these crowds that are so vicious when it comes to saying, well, you can't do that because this is the way it's been done for 30 years and you can't subvert that. And their voices, unfortunately, are often much louder than ours because, some of us are used to, well, basically disappearing for our own safety. We're not comfortable putting ourselves out there. And so I think the gatekeepers have gotten more numerous, much louder. The platforms are more, well, they're more variegated. And so there's more opportunities for them to basically stomp on people and say, well, this is how it's always been. It's how it should be.
Very, very good points. Anya, what would you add to that?
So Cindy, I loved your point about, fans. And I think it's really often under-recognized that, like, why do people write, speculative fiction in particular? Almost always because we started out as fans of the genre. And so it's not just an attempt to appeal to the fans. I think it's also a weakness of our own. It's a weakness within many of ourselves as writers that we're like, this is what we've fallen in love with. And so, for instance, like, if the only representation for people like us that we've seen in stories has been through these metaphors of these fantasy races, and that's the only version of anything that's not kind of a like European Christian normative white culture that has shown up in the fantasy books we love so much, then that's going to be how we start creating it. And, I mentioned I was very, very young when I started writing Queen of All. When I first started writing it, the two non-human fantasy races were the elves and the dwarves. And they were full on, like, the elves were tall and blonde and thin, and that made them beautiful. And the dwarves are short and stocky and hairy and hardworking and like full on, right? All the way there. Now, I was like a preteen, so I think I can give myself a pass. And I've totally reconfigured the way that it works in the books. And I hope that it's, thoughtful and decolonial now, but I think that that's a very natural part of the journey, is that, like, you read what you love it, you want to create it, you end up imitating the things that you've seen. And I think that a lot of writers are never challenged to move past that phase, because in a lot of ways it is what people are looking for. And like I said earlier, the craft of writing fantasy does not get taken that seriously. So we don't have a sense within the writing community as much as I think we do around issues of like diversity and getting a seat at the table and things like that. We don't, in terms of like representations of characters, we don't have the same kind of push to say we need to be decolonizing our fantasy world building. We need to be decolonizing the way that we construct fantasy races, because I think that fantasy just isn't taken as seriously as a genre. And I think it's really time to start. And that's going to be how we start to see a shift in the way that that gets represented.
Thank you, Anya. Whitney, what would you add?
Yeah, so we've covered the fans, and I think the gatekeeping, that's huge. That was one of the things that was running around in the back of my mind, is these, very loud people who have their opinions and, are the ones who get heard. We've covered writers ourselves. We've covered the genre, the industry. I mean, again, take it back to the Leigh and Lowe study. The vast, vast, vast majority, over 90%, I think it is, of editors, of acquiring editors, of marketing people, of agents, every level of the publishing industry is dominated by white, able-bodied, cis-het, straight people. Largely women until you get, I think, to the higher levels, and then it becomes male dominated. And that takes us back to, again, the ideas around what sells, and the ideas around what is good writing, and the idea around who the audience is. And I personally, I never wrote characters, as you know, like Anya was describing, my characters were always people who looked like me because I never saw me in a book. And when I was out querying, I think that made it difficult. I mean, you know, you get a lot of responses that say, wow, this is really well written. It's just not a fit for me. Wow, this is great. I love this story. I don't see a place for it. And it's like, okay, but I went and self-published it and the book has now sold over 3,100 copies in less than a year. And it's like, it clearly has an audience it can sell. But because of who is in charge and who is making sure that books get out there and who has the privilege of publishing a book, because I will say that self-publishing takes privilege. It takes money, it takes time that a lot of people simply don't have. And when we're not making room for people who are not the quote unquote norm to publish, that's how we get more entrenched. That's how we get dug in deeper and deeper and deeper, because we're not making space, we're not making it possible for other voices. And then just kind of stepping aside from all like the really big, heavy topics, I think another reason why we're so entrenched in it is because life is busy and chaotic and for a lot of people quite frightening right now. And they want something simple. People don't necessarily, writers or readers or whoever, may not have the capacity or the bandwidth to think about, what am I writing and how am I saying this? And is this right? And is this wrong? And oh my God, I'm going to get canceled. So I'm just going to write something very simple. And you know, it's not only simple, it feels safe to keep doing what has already been done. And I think, you know, in a world of pandemic and social justice movements and everything else that's going on, a lot of people want to feel safe. So they retreat into these entrenched, you know, narratives and archetypes. And we see kind of a backing away from trying something different. So I think there's kind of a lot of different things that play there in what's keeping these, you know, kind of harmful narratives and archetypes and stereotypes sticking around.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Okay, panel. So if we can put on our mentorship hat, if someone is wanting your advice, how can writers rethink fantasy races? And I think maybe we can combine this with our next question as well. What are some good things to keep in mind when crafting fantasy races to avoid pitfalls? Cindy, can I come to you first?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of hard to break out of certain mindsets, especially when you've been living in one place or one area for so long. So I was raised in California, Southern California, and I never thought I would move out of state. I thought I would stay in California for the rest of my life. And then, you know, life happened and I moved out of state. And now I'm in Utah, which is a very different state from California. And I never thought I would be here. But what it did for me was it helped me come into contact with other cultures and other ways of thinking and other perspectives that I wasn't getting enough of in California. And yes, I don't necessarily agree with those viewpoints, but at least I see them, you know, and I can try to empathize with them and I can try and see it from their viewpoint. So I think, you know, seeking out new experiences and seeking out different people to talk to and listening to their stories, whether it's a fiction story or their personal narrative, whatever that is really important to expand your worldview, because that will help populate like all the little things you have in your mind when it's time to brainstorm, you know, not just new races, but new settings and new societies and new ways of thinking. Because yeah, otherwise if you're just stuck in one place, then yeah, of course you're gonna just come up with the same old thing all the time.
Whitney, how would you back that up?
Yeah, so I really think that before people can really effectively rethink fantasy races, they need to engage with human races. They need to engage with the people who are already actively being affected and harmed, in particular by the real impacts, the real, you know, historical, just everything, baggage that has come with colonization and that has come with enslavement, and that, you know, the people who have historically just been left behind, and not just left behind, but actively excluded. You know, last year in June 2020, there were all these posts for like a month about anti-racism books that you can read. And the books hit the bestseller list. And I people went and read those books. How many people sat down and engaged and then went and did the work every single day thereafter? If you're not doing that, if you're not starting there with this very basic thing of humanity for the people in your society, in your community, I'm sorry, but it's not going to have the framework to rethink a fantasy race, because you don't have the grounding with human races, with human ethnicities, with human concerns, things that are going on in your own town that are impacting real lives. So it's, for me, it's got to start there. It's got to start with engaging in anti-racism, in you know, reading and studying, in talking to new people, getting familiar with the propaganda and the stereotypes that exist about people. That might be physical features, that might be cultural phenomena, that might be things that are accepted as fact, which are just simply not true. That could be knowing whose land you're on and what really happened to those people. I mean, how many of us take the time to say what indigenous people's land we are living on? What happened to them? Where are they now? Because I can 99% guarantee you they're probably not there. So those are the things I'd ask people to keep in mind as you're crafting these fantasy races is, have I done the work, you know, in the real world with real people? And I think once you've done that, it'll be a heck of a lot easier to, you know, engage with fantasy world building.
A lot of sense. Thank you, Whitney. Anya, how about you?
So to build off Whitney's really excellent points in a very, very practical sense, my kind of like go-to tip for this is that constructing fantasy races is not a substitute for engaging with racism in your work. And creating fantasy races is not a substitute for having characters of different human races in your work. If you have humans, they should be like the humans. If one of the races in your work is human, they should probably be like the humans in real life. I think this is one of the things that makes N.K. Jemison's use of orogeny, which is a form of magic, successful as a metaphor for racism, is that they also have actual racism, and they have different real races among humans who, as defined by like phenotypical traits and some cultural traits. And so you're going to want to like try to engage with that thoughtfully, I think is a good place to start. In creating fantasy races, I think it's good to have a general education about the history of race as a social construct, and broadly the evolution of racism, and particularly like racist stereotypes and broad ideas about different groups. Because you can't avoid them if you don't know what they are. And unless all of your kind of fantasy races are going to be based on stuff that you have specific cultural knowledge of, I think if you think that you're kind of making them up out of nowhere, it's useful to make sure that you really know that, because I think it you know, we're all kind of like slow cooking in this stew of culturally transmitted racism all the time. It's easy to pick up some of those ideas and stereotypes from like all of the other media we've ever consumed ever, and put it in our work by accident. So I think it's useful to really intentionally educate yourself about that. And then the other piece of advice that I would have is to start with a place of like creativity and kind of radical openness to different ideas that can happen. I mean, this stuff is hard to talk about. It's hard to write about. As Cindy mentioned, the gatekeepers have moved online, and I, like every other author I know worry all the time, or am I going to say something? Am I going to say or do something wrong? Am I going to upset people? The place where you have a responsibility to depict things in a rigorously ethical and accurate way is when you move to publishing and you start putting it out in the world. When you are creating, you owe it to yourself to be creative. And it's okay to make mistakes along the process, and to learn from them, as long as you continue to push yourself to learn and ideally take as many steps as possible to make sure that you're not putting material that contributes to harmful ideas out into the wider world where other people are going to see it. And so I would encourage people, especially because, I mean, the thing that's really amazing about speculative fiction to me is that we live in a world that has so many social constructs that are just like so bad. And the history of colonization and all of its ugly descendants of racism and stereotypes and bigotry and xenophobia that have all descended from like colonization are, it's really, really difficult to imagine what the world would be like without them. What our world would be like had those things not happened. It's almost impossible to think about. A fantasy world lets us imagine a world in which race means a totally different set of things. Like my fantasy series, for example, has human characters of all different races. There is no racism based on physical features, or skin color or things like that. I don't know if I did that successfully or not, but that was at least what I was attempting to depict. And I think like opening up those doors of what if we imagine this in a whole different way, it's really exciting. And I think we should let ourselves feel excited for the possibility that fantasy gives us to imagine a different world that could help make this world better.
How does freeing ourselves from a colonizer mindset aid in the diversification of fantasy fiction?
That's a great question. I'm glad I heard it. I think that it's important to recognize that whether we ourselves are marginalized people or not, we're all subjects of colonization. Everybody alive in the real world today, pretty much. I mean, I guess there's like one or two completely isolationist cultures left, but for the most part, everyone who's at this panel has been affected by colonization, and we are all kind of colonial subjects. We can't necessarily take a huge leap to free ourselves from that. But on the other hand, fantasy fiction lets us kind of imagine ways to start to get there, lets us imagine alternate worlds. And, you know, I'll reiterate something I mentioned earlier. I think that it's not just about, you know, the ethics of representation and writing as activism and writing to do good in the world. It's also going to make you a better writer, because the, you know, fantasy races as they currently exist in most mainstream fantasy media has been done over and over again. And like, frankly, it's pretty played out. And I think there's so many more new and exciting things you can do and say. And like, even if, you know, the kind of politics of representation piece isn't important or interesting to you at all, and you just want like cool looking magic creatures with cool magic powers, dream up your own. Think really big. That's what fantasy should be about. And so I think I'm excited to see it get there. I think the other piece of this is that we've seen a lot of push for representation in writing. And by representation, I mean like the presence of queer characters, characters of color, disabled characters, like existing in the text. And that's great. Like, that's super important. I'm not at all diminishing the importance of people being able to see themselves in what they read. But we also to start thinking about this at a broader, more structural level in terms of what, not just what kinds of faces show up on the book covers, but also like what style do we tell our stories in? What traditions are we drawing from? What ideas do we share? And I think that rethinking the way we look at fantasy races lets us do that, because it lets us look at, I mean, doing so in a more thoughtful and ethical way, for example, in my own work, really made me confront some deep pieces of the world building that were missing from my story. There wasn't enough history described between these different groups, and it didn't make sense to say that they've always been in conflict. Maybe that's what people believe, but is that true? And if it's not true, how has that shaped the history of the world? And it made the book richer and better and more interesting. And so I think when we rely on the way we've always done things, or the way that fantasy has always been written to do the work for us, as someone said earlier, it's much easier, right? Like that's a way easier way to write a book, is to rely on kind of ambient cultural knowledge to do some of the heavy lifting for us. But if we take that work on ourselves, we can actually create way, way more interesting, better books that have more interesting and important things to say. So I think it's a hard job, but it's a worthwhile one.
Thank you, Anya. Whitney, how would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have a couple of, I don't know if they're counterpoints or cautions to some of what Anya said. I think they're very good points, but I want to reassure people who are afraid that things are played out. They're not, in my opinion, and it's because not everyone has had a chance to tell those stories. That's why we're seeing, Cinderella is Dead is coming out. I was on a panel with the author of that book in another group, and there are so many different ways to tell the existing stories, and maybe I'm kind of like getting a bit too deep into the nitty-gritty there, but there is nothing new under the sun. The story has been told. It's, for me, a question of who is telling them. And then I think the other one is erasing racism from a work, and saying that, there's no racism based on physical features or whatever. I think I understand the motivation behind it, but I also caution that for me, as a Black woman, as a biracial woman, that can edge very close to being colorblind. And if you're not familiar with that term, that's where you say, oh, I don't see color. I don't care if you're black, white, green, purple, whatever. I just see you as human. And frankly, that's dangerous, because when you do not see color, when you erase racism based on physical features which exist in the real world, you're not seeing the ways in which you can help break it down. So again, those are just kind of gentle counterpoints or things to consider, to balance, those perspectives. I think they're very valid perspectives, and obviously fantasy is definitely a way to try and do things differently. But I would just say, do it with care, if you are going that way. As to how freeing ourselves from a colonizer mindset can aid in diversity of fiction, we just get stories that better reflect real human and therefore real reader experiences, because at the end of the day, the readers are the most important people. It's why we publish the books and not just, write quietly in our bedrooms and keep it all to ourselves in little journals, which is fine if you do that. It's fine. I'm not trying to denigrate that at all. But I am just saying, getting more people in to tell stories, getting more people in to share experiences. It's not just great for representation of the people who are marginalized and who have been, waiting for years maybe to see themselves represented. It also, as a secondary, I'm putting it as secondary because I want to center the marginalized experience here. Secondary to that, though, is allowing more people who are not marginalized to see us front and center, to see us powerful, to see us acting in spaces where we haven't been seen before, because that then forces them to see us and to imagine us in that way. And that, I think, is where, freeing from the colonizer mindset and writing can then ripple out. I think, Anya, that was an excellent point you made about what if we are the, the culture shapers. That's how it helps all of us, just not just as writers, not just as readers, but as society.
Thank you, Whitney. Appreciate that. Cindy, how would you wrap up this?
Gosh, I don't think I can in a neat little tiny bow for you. I'm sorry. I would just add that, yeah, it is really tough to free ourselves from our biases and our mindsets, the mindset that we've grown up with, but to be able to do it for, the colonizer mindset opens us up to possibility of also recognizing the other biases we bring to our stories, and the way we read and write those stories and tell those stories. So being a colonizer means it's your voice that's the dominant voice in the room or in the country or in the area, what have you. And one of the things I think about when it comes to diversification of stories is not just characters and skin color and things like that on the page, but also story structure. We are so well versed in the 3-act story structure, but that is a very Western type of storytelling. And now that we're getting more openness and more transparency into other types of stories, we're seeing, we're getting more recognition, for example, for the 4-act story structure from the Japanese and the Chinese, and the talk story in particular with the Chinese. Like, I used to think it was just my mom, talk, 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 talk. And now I realize, oh shoot, no, it's not just her. It's a cultural thing, and I would not have known that if I hadn't dug into it more and figured out, oh no, this is just how the Chinese pass down stories and parables and lessons and things like that. And it's because it's not taught in the Western schools. So yeah, I think the more that we can step back and say, yeah, everything I've learned up till this point has been through this filter, then the more we can say, oh, what else have I been missing? Because it's been filtered from my experience.
Thank you. Great point, Cindy. Okay, a couple more questions as we keep an eye on the time. What are some research tips that writers should be aware of as they are learning? Whitney, do you want to start us off here?
Yeah, sure. So I think a really important one is to look for resources from the marginalized people speaking for themselves. I think there are a lot of people these days who want to speak over marginalized people or speak for marginalized people. Frankly, most of them don't have the range. And it's not their place to speak for other people on the experiences that they haven't had. So look for research, look for sources, look for leaders and voices and activists of people from representing themselves. With that in mind, groups are not a monolith. That's been covered a few times in the panel already. The same problems with homogenous cultures, that applies to groups. The thoughts or opinions or experiences of any one individual in a group may not reflect or be shared by the rest of the group. Those experiences and everything will also be affected by intersectionality. My experience as a Black woman is also impacted by the fact that my mother is white and therefore I'm biracial and therefore I'm lighter skinned than some people. It's impacted by the fact that I have a certain level of educational and socioeconomic status. It's impacted by where I grew up. So, my experience as a, Black woman growing up in the United States is not going to be the same as a gay Black man or just somebody who grew up somewhere else. So just be very careful to seek a diversity of resources, and it can't be a checkbox like, okay, I spoke to my Black person, I spoke to my gay person, I spoke to my, no, it's got to be a diversity not only of people but of sources. And And then I think just also to consider the context of diversity and inclusion. What is diverse to you will not feel diverse to somebody else. So that's where I think we really need to know just kind of who we intend our audience to be. You know, like my background is in marketing. And I can tell you your audience is not everybody. So it just, as long as you know who you're trying to write for, who your audience is, who you expect to, you know, be speaking to, I think that will really be something that informs what you consider diversity and inclusion and how you talk about it and what you say and who is centered, and whether that's really your story to tell. So just some things to think about.
Thank you, Whitney. Thanks for those notes. Anya, what notes would you add?
I would add to that, the most helpful kind of research that I found is not in looking at certain things as research, like sitting down to, you know, educate myself about a topic. It's just broadening the kinds of media that I do consume when I am especially reading in my own reading time, because the all of the kind of tropes that show up in fantasy, especially around race, fantasy or otherwise, were shaped by the media that I consumed. Some might say excessively or obsessively when I was growing up. You know, anything, if it had a dragon on the cover, I was going to read it, you know? And so that shaped my understanding probably of the whole world, and certainly of how media should look, and certainly of how stories work and story structure and the kinds of characters that could be in stories. The best way to counteract that is to literally counteract it. And the great news is there are so many incredible fantasy novels coming out by so many diverse writers. I really encourage people to look beyond the big 5 publishers. It's going to take a little more legwork. It's going to be a little bit harder because you can't necessarily walk into every bookstore in the country and expect to find every book that's self-published or published by a small press. But small presses and self-publishers, way more likely to be telling those kinds of stories. And I'll also say from what I know from my fellow debut writers, less likely to try to reshape the story to be more easily consumed by a mainstream white audience. Less likely to say, you can't depict the character in this way because people won't get it. I'm not saying that doesn't happen to indie or self-published authors. It's just like it has. I'm with a small publisher, and it's been my experience that they've been super respectful of all the kind of like cultural and identity elements of my work, and I think they have more ability to do so. So I recommend that. If you're looking for resources, I have to put in a plug for the 20 Wonders is we have a website, we have a Slack group. It's all the traditionally published debuting novelists of the year in YA and middle grade, including small presses, bigger presses, medium, everything. And there is such a group every year, and I think a lot of people don't necessarily know about it. It's a fabulous resource to find out, you know, who's coming out with their first book, and that's a really important way to support diverse authors, because that can be make or break it. Like, did people buy this first book? Can answer the question of, are you going to get offered a second book deal? But there's so much out there that's phenomenal, and a lot of the like biggest and best names in fantasy right now are marginalized authors writing own voices stories that are just like so incredible and exciting. And I promise, like, if you Google best fantasy novels by women of color, like, you will get an incredible list of incredibly talented people. And just make a little, like, look for a Goodreads list if you're looking to learn more about like a particular culture, ethnicity, religion, race. Seek out books by authors from that group, but seek out the books you would usually read. You know, read in your genre, read what you like. Don't make it like this is my time to do my self-educational chore that I have to do. Incorporate it, really incorporate it into your life as a reader and a writer. And I think that's going to be the way to make that research sustainable. It's also going to be a way to read a lot of really good books, which is always something that I encourage.
Always a good thing. Thank you for those notes, Anya. All right, Cindy, what notes would you add?
I'd say it continually surprises me, and I don't know why it does, how many writers I hear say, oh, I am so busy writing, I don't have time to read. And I go, but why are you writing if you weren't a reader first? And I hesitate to say that out loud because I feel like it's a little bit elitist. But yeah, I mean, to echo what Anya's saying, read widely, and read with an eye toward, okay, what did they do? What did they incorporate into their stories that I could have possibly done as well and done better and to help improve my craft? But also read for pleasure too. That is one of the things when I stopped writing seriously. There was a period of time when I was working in the corporate world and I just didn't have time to read, much less write. So I was not reading or writing nearly enough. And I definitely felt like I had this big gap in my education when it came to speculative fiction. So when I returned to speculative fiction, reading and writing, the first thing I did was Google best fantasy novels of 2016 or whatever, the Nebula Awards list. I mean, like the whole thing, I just built these lists from all these different sources to figure out, okay, who's writing fantasy and science fiction now? And who should I be aware of? And I just slowly built my repertoire back up from that. Also, when you said earlier about, checking off your check boxes, I wanted to say, yeah, we're not bingo cards. I mean, please don't go to your BIPOC LGBTQ friends and say, hey, can you tell me everything there is to know about this? Because that is just, I'm sorry, but that is just so lazy. And I wasn't quite as aware of this until I moved to the state that I'm in now, where, yeah, I'm sometimes the only spot of diversity in a room, in an entire room. And so, yeah, I get targeted by people who are like, oh, there's an Asian lady, I can go talk to her about Asian fantasy. And I'm like, I'm not a huge fan of martial arts. Like, don't put me in that stereotype, dudes. So one of the best tips that I can give to people when they want to find out more about martial arts fantasy, wuxia, or samurai westerns, whatever they're interested in, is besides Google, is check out Twitter. Like, I hate Twitter. It's awful. It's busy. It is not my platform at all. And I'm older, so I mean, it could be part of the get off my lawn mentality. But I love Twitter for the fact that you can lurk, you can eavesdrop on people's conversations as they're talking about what it means to be, a person of color, to be queer, to be marginalized in whatever fashion that you're interested in researching more about. Drop in on those conversations and just listen. Don't feel like you have to participate because you probably don't have, enough context yet. And that'll get you started on figuring out how to more thoughtfully approach someone and say, hey, I want to have a conversation about X. And I read this and this and that, or I'm aware of this and this and that. What are your thoughts? Because I'm really interested in your opinion and not just, your opinion as the whole representative of this group.
Awesome. Thank you, Cindy. So we've talked a lot about this. Why don't we go ahead and give some shout outs then? Like, what are some examples of stories that have done this well? And what lessons can we learn from them? Like, can we give some shout outs here? Why don't we start with you, Anya?
Yeah, I mean, I have a fair number of books I'd love to shout out for this. I already mentioned N.K. Jemisin. I think the only person who can do magic as a metaphor for fantasy racism really excessively well. And that works both because she addresses racism as something much more similar to the racism that we have in the real world, and because she's with the incredibly clear parallels that she draws between the kinds of discrimination that origins face in her world and specifically anti-Black racism, slavery, and colonialism. She's incredibly thoughtful about the points of similarity that exist, rather than just kind of creating that metaphor and like leaving it to simmer in the reader's mind. She's really thoughtful and specific about the use of slurs that get directed and the specific visceral forms of physical violence that go along with slavery. So I sort of can't recommend that enough. I would also shout out The Poppy War. Does this really well in terms of rethinking the idea of a magical race, because there's no other than some divine characters, there's no sort of semi-human characters the way we often think of fantasy races as being, you know, I think in D&D, the way they say it is like people but not humans, right? Like all of the people in the Poppy War are humans, but one race of characters has some magical affinities that others do not, and are very much dehumanized in ways that are, again, analogous to real world racism, and it's done really skillfully. Those books are both like pretty emotionally brutal reads. I wish I had like a lighter recommendation to make. So I guess I'll leave with a sci-fi example, which is The Sparrow and its sequel, Children of God, which is, it's not a recent novel. It is a novel of colonization of a actually Jesuit-funded space expedition to a planet that is already occupied by other sentient races. And it's very thoughtful about how it navigates the politics of race among the various human members of this space mission, and the relationships between the two different indigenous cultures on that other planet. And so those would be some examples that I would point to where I think it's done really quite well. Probably not perfectly in any of those cases, but really well. And I just wanted to jump off of something Whitney said earlier with regard to, you know, every story's been told before, but who is getting to tell them? I actually wanted to say that, and I couldn't find the words to say it, because I think I got that a lot when I was getting rejection letters from agents was, oh, well, we're over epic fantasy. Epic fantasy's played out, it's done. And I was like, yeah, but like when we were doing epic fantasy, you didn't let gay people publish books though. So can we go back to that now that I can be in the room? And so I think that a lot of these, some of the books that I recommended, they're not so different from the way that, especially The Sparrow, it's not so different than other colonization novels within that kind of sci-fi genre, but just more thoughtful. And more thoughtful about what it means to be a colonial subject and what it means to experience discrimination and racism and prejudice as a human, and then what it might mean in a new world and how those contexts might change each other. So I think there's a lot of books that are exploring this in a really interesting way, but I will leave us with those three.
Thank you, that's a great start. Whitney, what shout outs would you give?
This one is more of a sci-fi, but I think we can say similar things of aliens, space aliens, as we can with fantasy races. So I thought of the Lilith's Brood series by Octavia Butler. It's an older one, but I know that she's kind of come back into people's consciousness lately. But the story literally deals with the like recolonization of Earth by kind of blend of aliens and humans after humans have destroyed the world. And the difference being that it's written by a Black woman from the perspective of a Black protagonist. So just kind of shifting the mindset and shifting the lens from which you're reading that, I think can help see a different way to do it and to do it well. And I do really think that Anya and Cindy both made excellent points on that. Make it fun. I kind of went in with all these like, do this serious into it, but it's like, no, you can make it fun. It's okay. It's really okay, I promise. So, thank you to Anya and Cindy for both mentioning that it can be fun and you're allowed to make it fun. It's okay. I promise.
Good point. Thank you, Whitney. Cindy, what shout outs would you give?
So I've got an older one and a newer one. Older one, so back when I loved epic fantasy, I read less of it now. I'm sorry, Anya. But back when I loved epic fantasy, you saw these blonde-haired farm boys everywhere, right? I mean, that was your chosen one stereotype. So it blew me away when I read Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea series, because it was, when I think about, I think it was the first non-white protagonist in a epic fantasy that I read or I came across. And so I was like, oh, well, this is cool. Like, everyone's brown and red and, the white folks are kind of off here. And so it was very different for me. And I thought it was just groundbreaking the way she handled the races in her Earthsea world. And then in a similar sort of vein, I read later, much later as an adult, and it's probably a good thing, so I probably would not have understood it as a younger reader, possibly, is her Left Hand of Darkness standalone book. It was just, she treats, it's not just race, but it's also genders, and how this one species treats gender in a very different way than the species that, we're used to as humans, if you will. And I thought that was just super innovative, and it just was eye-opening for me of like, oh, well, it's not just about skin color, it's also about sexual identity and stuff. So that was really cool for me. Something a little bit more contemporary is Seanan McGuire's Wayward Children series. It's a novella series, so they're shorter reads. And it is portal fantasy, but so the way she set it up is genius because there are limitless portals. And yes, she does bring in traditional fantasy races and tropes and stereotypes, but she subverts them. And of course, she doesn't in just quintessential McGuire fashion. There's a goblin market, for example, but it's not the goblin market you're used to or that we're used to. And it's just, there's in her latest one, Across the Green Grass Fields, there's centaurs. Like, okay, how many centaur stories have we read? But then you read hers and you're like, holy crap, that is way different. And that is so cool, what she's done with that race in that series. So yeah, she's got all sorts of different reimaginings in that series, and I just look forward to seeing more from Seanan McGuire there.
Perfect. Thank you, Cindy. That's awesome. Okay, so it's just about the time to begin wrapping up our panel. I want to thank our panelists for their time and expertise on this topic. You guys have been awesome. We will stay in the chat for a little bit longer to continuing answering questions from the Right Hive 2021 attendees. But to wrap up today, why don't we go around the room and briefly let our viewers know what projects you would like to plug and how to find you after the conference. Cindy, why don't I stay with you?
All right. So I don't like to talk about myself. It's just so odd. But you can find updates of my work on my website, www.chhung.com. And there's a contact form on there as well if you want to get a hold of me afterward. So.
Thank you very much. Anya, is there anything you'd like to plug, and how can we find you after the conference?
Yeah, I love to talk about myself. So I have a whole list ready to go. You can find links to all of my published work and everything going back to high school that I've literally ever published, as well as a contact form and all my social media on my website, which is just www.anyajosephs.com, JOSEPHS. And there's also links to all my social at Linktree / Anya Leigh Josephs. Another good way to contact me is on Twitter. Even though, like everyone else, I hate Twitter, I'm also on Twitter 24/7. So at Anya_writes. And the project I would most like to plug is my forthcoming debut novel, which will be very forthcoming by the time this panel airs, will be about 6 weeks out. You can find links to all of this on my website, all over my Twitter. Please, if you're interested, look up Queen of All on Goodreads, add it to your TBR. If you want to pre-order it, so far there's only digital pre-orders for Kindle, but paperback pre-orders should be available very, very soon, certainly by the time this panel airs. And so you can find all of that information and get a copy if you're interested. Let me know what you think.
Thank you, Anya. Whitney, is there anything you'd like to plug, and how can we find you after the conference?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm currently almost done with the Shadows of Other Side series. So again, that's book 1, which is Elemental, book 2, which is Eldritch Sparks, and then book 3, which is Ethereal Secrets. I'm really excited that book 4, Ebon Rebellion, is coming out. I think it should be probably 6 weeks after this panel airs, if not a little bit longer. You can find those books, anywhere books are sold. You can find me at my website, Whitney Hill Writes, WRITES.com. And then you can find me on Twitter or Instagram at write_wherever. So again, that's write, WRITE. And yeah, I'm always happy to, hear what people think and just, connect with readers. I'm always sharing stuff about North Carolina because that's where I live and that's where the books take place. And I just want to add a little bit more depth to the story. So if that's interesting to you, then come give me a look.
Awesome. Thank you, Whitney. Okay, so that does it for this panel on Decolonize Your Craft. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a lot. On behalf of Anya Leigh Josephs, Sia Chung, and Whitney Hill, I'm Stephanie Contreras. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you soon.